Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Friday, it's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
David French, welcome back.
Skye, thanks for having me.
It's always good to see you. Okay, before we get into like the real meat of this episode and what I want to talk about, I want to begin. We haven't nerded out in a little while. And have you been watching Rings of Power season 2?
Oh my goodness, Skye. So this is where I just almost have to turn in my nerd card.
Oh no.
Because I've been traveling so much and running around the country so much, I have decided to wait and reserve until I can watch it all. So I have not yet dove in, and I'm embarrassed. I'm ashamed. I really don't have anything to say to justify myself, but that it is what it is.
I get it. I've been traveling a lot too. I've been gone every week this month, but here for some reason, my travel dates are always on Thursday. I'm flying on Thursday. And that's when new episodes come out. And I have been downloading each episode before I get on the flight so that I can watch it on the flights because it's just something to pass the time. So David, I will let this slide, but you can do better.
Well, I will just say I refuse to watch it on a laptop screen or an iPad or anything like that. That's why I haven't watched it. I have ample opportunity to watch it on the road on my computer, but I want to watch it in 4K glory on the biggest screen that I possibly can access. So that's my reasoning.
Okay, so you're not actually neglecting it. You are trying to honor.
I'm trying to honor the art for the, I'm trying to honor the vision of the creators of the art by seeing it in the medium that it was intended to be seen in. That's why I have delayed.
Forgive my judgment.
You are forgiven.
It was premature.
Barely.
Okay.
You're barely forgiven.
We will circle back to that then once you get around to it. The other thing I wanted to briefly touch on is this amazing attack that occurred last week when Israel apparently triggered bombs that were hidden in pagers of Hezbollah combatants in Lebanon. It's still unfolding, and this seems to be an escalation. The two sides are ramping things up. But just your initial thoughts on that attack.
Yeah.
And what it signaled both about Israel's capabilities and what Israel's hoping or trying to accomplish with this attack.
Well, I mean, let's just look at it, let's zoom out real quickly and just look at it from a military perspective, and then we'll look at it from the legal/moral perspective. On the military perspective, the sequence of events that unfolded is, if someone had written it up in a thriller, like a Tom Clancy style military thriller, you would think, come on, Tom, let's keep this grounded in realism, because the sequence is absurd. So you have Israel, intelligence efforts and intelligence gathering efforts cause Hezbollah to question the security of their cell phones. So then they move from cell phones to pagers, and they actually end up buying the pagers from basically Israel, which had set up a series of shell companies, had actually even manufactured normal pagers. And so then Israel, and this is the part that, there will be books written about, Israel gets into the Hezbollah supply chain where Israel is actually making pagers specifically for Hezbollah military communications. Israel then detonates the pagers, which causes Hezbollah to say, well, let's go to our backup, which is walkie talkies. Don't know exactly how this happened, but Israel had apparently infiltrated that supply chain at some point as well. So they detonate the walkie talkies. So then Hezbollah says, well, we need to meet in person. So a big bunch of their military leaders meet in person. And again, we don't know how Israel penetrated Hezbollah security to the point where they could find out where and when the meeting was taking place, but they did, and they blew up the meeting. And from a military standpoint, I mean, the reason to do this is about as obvious as you can get. I mean, you're disrupting your enemy's communications. You're taking thousands of their fighters out of the field, disproportionately concentrated in the leadership. In the event of escalation in the war, which is occurring right now, they don't have a secure line of communication. They don't know what they can trust from a communication standpoint. All of this is absolutely, the military advantage is absolutely clear. The legal situation does have one point of controversy, and this is something that is worth talking about just a bit. So from your traditional military perspective, which is a strike is deemed lawful if it meets the requirements of military necessity. So taking on the leadership of your enemy that's launching rockets at your civilian population. That meets that definition of necessity. Distinction, in other words, trying to focus and target only your enemy and nobody else but your enemy. There were, sadly, some civilian casualties here, but very, very small number compared to the total strike. And so the principle of distinction was covered. And then proportionality. Are you using any more military force than is necessary to accomplish the objective? And these explosives were quite small. You saw them go off in videos right next to other people without harming other people. So there was a proportionate response here. But here's the question, Skye. The law of war as a general matter frowns on booby traps. And the DoD, US DoD manual, says that you can't manufacture just consumer goods like watches, personal audio players, cameras, toys, and make them explosive. And the reason is this prohibition, this is what the DoD manual says, this prohibition is intended to prevent the production of large quantities of dangerous objects that can be scattered around and are likely to be attractive to civilians, especially children. The reason for this prohibition is really clear. They don't want combatants spreading harmless, seemingly harmless stuff around in a civilian context where civilians can pick it up and be terribly injured or killed. And this refers to actual practices we've seen from, say, for example, there's stories from the Soviet army in Afghanistan where they manufactured toys and were blowing up Afghan children. This was a manufacturing process that was specifically related to the military pagers used by Hezbollah. So I don't think that specific booby trap prohibition applies to specifically a military object manufactured for a military purpose and distributed to military individuals. But that's the source of some critique of the strike, because the other elements of the law of armed conflict would clearly vindicate this as a very, very precise strike.
Yeah. When I first heard about it, my reaction was, number one, after the humiliation of October 7th for the Israeli Defense Forces, it seemed like their announcement that our reputation as being the most savvy intelligence force in the world is still intact. Like, we can get you anywhere. That's been the reputation of the Mossad since the early 20th century. And wow, this is something, you're right, it feels like it came out of a Tom Clancy novel. But then secondly, it's hard to think of a more precision-oriented attack on Israel's enemies than this. I mean, Hezbollah has been firing missiles into northern Israel for quite some time. They've been killing indiscriminately. There was a famous slaughter of a group of children playing soccer because these missiles are imprecise and they're just randomly falling and killing people. So for Israel to do a counterattack in any other form, I imagine would have more collateral damage than what these pager strikes did or the walkie-talkie explosions did. None of them can ever be completely, precise without any collateral damage. But it was just stunning to see it. But my concern is this Netanyahu and the Israeli government deciding to broaden the war, obviously beyond Gaza. There's been skirmishes at the northern border with Hezbollah ever since last October. But it seems like their announcement that we're coming, we're not going to allow this skirmish to continue as is. And the expansion of the war could have real implications, of course, not just for people in that region, but for American politics.
Well, and so there's a couple of things in play here. One is, and you're talking about the difference between this operation and the total intelligence failure on October 7th. I mean, there needs to be accountability for that. But this is what you call trying to restore deterrence. Mm-hmm. So, and it's not just the pager attack. Remember, diplomatic head of Hamas killed in Tehran in a breathtaking intel operation that got an explosive in one of the most secure areas of Iran. And so they've been doing a number of things that have been designed to restore deterrence. But the other thing is that there's been about 50, 150. I mean, the numbers are, I've heard different numbers of people who've had to just flee their homes in northern Israel because of these rocket attacks from Hezbollah. And so what's happened is Hezbollah, through its rocket attacks, has essentially shrunk the territory, the inhabitable territory of Israel. And so Israel has stated as a war aim the restoration of northern Israeli citizens to their homes in northern Israel. So that means you either have to knock back Hezbollah's military capability to an extent where they're not able to threaten northern Israel, which would be a giant military task. Or you have to deter Hezbollah from continued rocket attacks. And it's quite obvious that Israel is engaging in an escalation process that is designed to try to deter Hezbollah short of the full-on invasion. But I think Israel might be willing to do the full-on invasion of southern Lebanon to restore the ability of northern Israelis to come back to their homes. And if that kicks off, Skye, you said it well, that will have implications perhaps globally, especially if Iran comes to the aid of Hezbollah, which Hezbollah is essentially a proxy army for Iran. So
right.
Very dangerous and delicate moment.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like the politics in Israel is helping either, because Netanyahu is a self-interest in keeping this conflict going in some form or another.
Yeah, one thing I really wish a lot of especially American conservatives would realize is, people have spent kind of the default position on the American right has been to like Bibi Netanyahu, to sort of see him as broadly allied with us. But a lot of things have happened in Israel and with Netanyahu since those early days. And a lot of it is profoundly negative, just profoundly negative, especially when you're talking about the disproportionate power that the far right settler movement, which is in some ways just out and out grossly racist, believe it or not, that the way in which he depends on some of those elements to cling to power is really destructive. And a lot of people in America have been sort of taught by sort of right-wing media over the years that you have two choices, Bibi Netanyahu and some sort of like surrender Israeli leftist. No. That is not the dynamic at all. And if you talk to an Israeli progressive, they will say to you, and, I strongly recommend my colleague Ezra Klein's podcast, his most recent podcast.
I just listened to that yesterday on my flight home, and it was great.
Strongly recommend, with David Remnick from the New Yorker. Remnick has been looking at Israeli politics for basically forever. And one of the points they made is there just isn't an Israeli left or center left that is a true factor here.
Yeah.
And it's basically been that case since Second Intifada. And so it is not the case that you're dealing with a choice between Bibi Netanyahu and some sort of surrender leftism. You're dealing with Netanyahu, who has alliances with the dangerous far right, corruption problems, and who presided over the worst intelligence failure, arguably since the Yom Kippur War. And I would say certainly since the Yom Kippur War. And yeah. So it's just people need to reset their categories a bit in my mind.
Well, and after our own election in November, depending on who's elected and who's sitting in the White House, it could mean a recalibration of America's relationship with Israel and its military support. It's a whole fascinating, moving target right now, but we'll come back to that as things develop. I want to take time to talk about a piece you wrote recently about the Pope.
Yeah.
And you often cover religious topics, obviously in your New York Times op-ed, but this is the first time I recall you writing about Pope Francis so closely. I'm sure you've done it in the past. I just haven't seen it.
No, I've barely written about Pope Francis. Yeah.
So he said some things recently that has gotten more conservative segments of the Catholic Church really animated, very upset. So he was in Singapore, and he said that religions are, quote, like different languages in order to arrive at God. But God is God for all. And if God is God for all, then we are all sons and daughters of God, end quote. It echoes of Gandhi's old statement about all paths lead to God, all roads, ascend the mountain. It describes some of the feedback that you've seen coming from the conservative end of the Catholic community.
Yeah, it's been, basically, Skye, what you would imagine is if the same kind of feedback as if somebody said that who was like a president of a Baptist seminary. What do you mean? There is one path to God. It comes through faith and, affirmative declaration of faith in Jesus Christ. All other religions are paths away from God. There was a very vividly written piece in First Things, in which the Archbishop Emeritus of Philadelphia, Charles, and I hope I don't mispronounce this, Chaput, wrote, to suggest even loosely that Catholics walk a more or less similar path to God as other religions drains martyrdom of its meaning.
Yeah.
Why give up your life for Christ when other paths may get us to the same God? And so there was a very strong negative reaction to that, and which puzzled me a little bit, because I'd actually been following this issue for some time, especially the way Catholics articulated it. And it surprised me because I remember Pope John Paul II, nobody's idea of a liberal, nobody's running around saying, man, that liberal Pope JP2, nobody's idea of a liberal had written. He's also known as sort of one of the more prominent Catholics ever to really pursue inter-religious dialogue. And Pope John Paul II, the various religions arose from a, quote, primordial human openness to God. And then he said, this is John Paul II, it will be in the sincere practice of what is good in their own religious traditions and by following the dictates of their own conscience that the members of other religions respond positively to God's invitation and receive salvation in Jesus Christ, even while they do not recognize or acknowledge him as their savior. So this is something that goes back to John Paul II. And I read Pope Francis as basically in an off-the-cuff press conference or Q&A, saying basically what John Paul II said, but John Paul II said it in a sort of more precise, polished way because it was a written document. He was writing this out, and that comes from something he said in 1998. And so that's the setting for the discussion. That's the sort of background for the discussion in my newsletter.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like Pope Francis's words could be interpreted along a spectrum.
Yeah.
Some would hear this as he's advocating universalism, that everyone is saved regardless of their posture towards Jesus Christ and whatever. It's just universalism. Others might take a more nuanced view, maybe like Pope John Paul II, to say all these religions are emerging from a primordial, I think was his word, right? Primordial desire for God, and we're all searching for him. And maybe if you were to corner Pope Francis, he would say, yeah, the ultimate revelation of who God is through Jesus Christ, but these other ways are searching for him and stumbling along trying to find that truth, and we should honor that. The idea that he's advocating for universalism, though, is really upsetting some people. And I get why the Archbishop would say, well, this drains martyrdom of its meaning, because why would anybody die for their faith in Christ if it doesn't matter all that much, if other roads are just as legitimate? You unpack this in your piece, though, and combine it with something else that the Pope said on this same trip that had to do with American politics.
Right.
He was asked about whether American Catholics should support Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. And he didn't give a clear answer on that.
No.
He said both of them are against life, and he criticized Harris for being very pro-choice, which is kind of a foundational message of her campaign. And he criticized Donald Trump for his view of immigrants. And he kind of said, it's up to each person's conscience about who to support. There's not a clear winner. But combine these two statements, his ambiguity about who's saved and who isn't, and then his ambiguity about which candidate to support, like taken together, it's like a perfect irritant for a conservative Catholic or a conservative Christian in an American context. Like they'd be pulling their hair out over this. So describe how you interpret the Pope's positioning, whether it's doctrinally on this question of salvation or politically on the question of presidential candidates.
Yeah, I took it as a matter of existential humility that, I don't think that anyone would argue that the leader of the world's largest church disbelieves that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. That the idea that Pope Francis would not believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, I don't find that credible in the larger context of all of his comments and statements. I think what I took him to be saying is just a far more modest thing, which is, I'm not defining the mind of God in his approach to other human beings in this mysterious, in the mystery of salvation. Now, And also, I'm not going to presume to tell you the mind of God when it comes to this, the much less important issue of, this American election. And so I took this really as a pretty remarkable statement by, arguably the world's foremost single religious leader, a pretty remarkable statement of humility, believe it or not, that I'm not going to override your conscience in the voting. And then also, I'm not going to presume that I'm going to know the mind of God regarding salvation and of any individual given human soul.
But okay, David, what is the point of being a Christian leader or being religious at all if I can't know definitively exactly who's going to hell and which candidate is going to destroy America?
I know. And that does speak to the level of certainty we crave. So, for example, I would say that Pope Francis would say that you actually can be certain in salvation, that you can say, if you believe in Jesus Christ, that Jesus is Lord, and he would there would be the Catholic elements of salvation and all of that, but the issue isn't are you uncertain about who Jesus is? The issue isn't are you uncertain about what Jesus and salvation of your soul? The question is, how much uncertainty do you have about another human being's soul? Mm-hmm. And a lot of people just don't. There's no ambiguity. There's no uncertainty that they're going to believe that they absolutely know. And this is an issue, Skye, that has plagued me. My whole life, I grew up in a very fundamentalist church, and I remember being asked point blank by one of my non-Christian friends, and he said, "Am I going to hell?" That was the question he asked me is, "Am I going to hell?" And my 18-year-old answer was, "I don't know, but I can definitely tell you how to be saved." And that's because, as I was reading scripture, this sort of idea that I can step in and judge another person's immortal soul seems out of my purview. But what is within my purview is to say, hey, I know Jesus, and this is, let me tell you about Jesus. That seems absolutely in my purview. And so that's why I wrote about this. I thought this was a fascinating discussion and a great way to sort of introduce the concept of existential humility and contrast it with sort of a fundamentalism that does not permit the kind of uncertainty that you and I are talking about.
Right. Okay. So you're assuming things about Pope Francis, which I think are correct, which are, a generous posture that based on other things he said in his lifetime of ministry that we can assume about his view of faith. But what's interesting to me is that those who are upset at these statements, either the political statement or the doctrinal one, what they seem to be saying is not only should I be able to dismiss somebody of another faith or know for certain about what their relationship with God is or isn't, and not only can I have definitive certainty about which candidate is on God's side, but I can also now definitively write off Pope Francis.
Right. Because
of his seeming lack of certainty, he's now in the camp of the condemned.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me that it isn't merely those who are different than me that need to be excommunicated, but those who don't agree with my certainty, even when they agree with me on my faith, must be written off as well.
Right.
So doesn't that lead to a kind of fundamentalism which is just incredibly lonely and isolating?
Well, the irony of fundamentalism is that in many ways it is actually built around community, in the sense that me and mine versus you and yours. So you find your tribe, and your tribe is, we are the chosen ones. We are the saved. We are, we are the church. And then, at that point, there's an enormous amount of certainty, and there's enormous amount of kind of group solidarity, especially if people come against that, So
right.
You see a lot of this in very fundamentalist sects where people will have an enormous amount of certainty and then an enormous amount of community because they feel like we're the guardians of the true light, for example. But the interesting psychology of all that, Skye, is why fundamentalism just constantly sort of waxes and wanes. It will wax and then it will kind of burn itself out, is that when fundamentalism needs an enemy. It needs an enemy, and it will often find its enemies very close at hand, and will start to tear apart its own community after a while. And so, I saw this when I was growing up. You can go to Middle Tennessee and you can find a Church of Christ. Back in the era when I was growing up, Church of Christ, the a cappella churches of Christ were much more fundamentalist than they are now. They're very different than they are now. But you could see a Church of Christ down the street from another Church of Christ. And if you got into the history of it all, you would find out that maybe they split because one faction wanted to put a kitchen in the fellowship hall. And that created a huge argument over whether the New Testament permits like kitchens and fellowship halls.
Heretics.
Yeah. And so that's what happens is, there's this irony of fundamentalism that it often flourishes through this sort of group solidarity, tribalism, but then it's so fundamentally antagonistic that over time it will tear apart that solidarity.
Yeah. And obviously Protestant history especially is full of this.
My gosh. Yeah.
The word comes from protests, right? Mm-hmm. They're fighters. They are always looking for the heretics so they can break off. And that's why there are thousands of Protestant denominations. I think what's interesting about what's going on, and of course, this is not my community, I'm speaking as an outsider, is I thought Catholicism was more immune from that. Like, it seems to me if you are a Catholic fundamentalist, it's pretty hard to say that the Pope himself doesn't qualify as within the bounds of your faith because he's the Pope, for goodness sake. So are we seeing that this trend towards fundamentalism is breaking the bounds of where it normally lives and it's entering into other segments of both religious and secular life?
Oh, that's a great question. And this is one where I'm going to have to punt on lack of expertise. But in my experience, there's a lot of divisions in the Catholic Church as well. I mean, you've got different, you have different orders.
Right.
Sometimes you will see some of the most inflammatory stuff on Twitter that rivals anything you would ever see when, the Protestant sort of theobros go at each other hammer and tongs. I've seen very, very similar things on the Catholic side. So I am not certain how much less or more fractious Catholicism is compared to American Protestantism, but I do know for certain that Protestant fundamentalism it's extraordinarily fractious. I was reading an interesting discussion of all of the different offshoots of Presbyterianism and how you've had various sort of micro denominations formed over the years. And this is something we're very, very familiar with in Protestantism. I think there are similar psychologies in work in Catholicism because ultimately fundamentalism is a psychology, not a theology, as Richard Land said very insightfully many years ago. But I am not qualified to opine on the full level of and intensity of the disagreements within Catholicism.
The Holy Post is sponsored by Faithful Counseling. I'm not super good at people stuff. I like ideas and technology and puppets. When Lisa and I got married, it was a shock to see just how different we approach the world and each other. The thoughtful gift of marriage counseling from one of our parents was a huge help in those early years. Faithful Counseling can help you get through life's rough spots with more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states. Faithful Counseling makes it easy to find a great therapist that'll work for you. You can meet over video or phone sessions, and changing therapists is easy and free until you find the right fit. So don't struggle alone. Let Faithful Counseling match you with a licensed therapist who can help you grow into the best version of yourself. Visit faithfulcounseling.com/holypost and get the professional, faith-based counseling you need. And there's a special offer for our listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. Thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode. This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Hiya Health. Hey, do you have kids? Do you care about their health? Of course you do. Most kids' vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk kids really shouldn't be eating. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin for kids. 0 sugar, 0 gummy junk, yet they taste great and are perfect for picky eaters. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you need to go to hiyahealth.com/holypost. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/holypost and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And thanks to Hiya Health for sponsoring this episode.
Okay, let me turn a little bit then towards the politics for a second, and the Pope's statement about it's up to the conscience of each person to figure out who to vote for and all this whole thing. You wrote another piece recently where you talked about how MAGA supporters kind of fall for anything, and you were specifically talking about this nonsense in Springfield, Ohio, about Haitian migrants stealing and eating people's pets, which has just gone on and on and on. But you made a case in your article that I found intriguing. I think it was that article where you talked about part of the MAGA movement finds a lot of joy and delight in some of the more outrageous conspiracy theories and nonsense. And there's a revelry in it all. Yeah. And it caught my attention because since Kamala Harris became the candidate for the Democrats, she has made joy a theme of her campaign. You saw this very clearly at the DNC, and Oprah Winfrey up there and screaming joy, over and over again. And it was all about joy, joy, joy. And they were trying to contrast Kamala Harris and her campaign with sort of American carnage and all the doomsday rhetoric that was coming out of the Trump campaign. But your argument is there's this weird kind of joy that exists on the Trump side as well, but it's a joy that delights in cruelty. Yeah. And in negativity towards certain groups. Unpack that a little bit, and then I want to bring it back around to the Pope's comments.
Yeah. So what you notice if you're close to MAGA is that, as soon as the Springfield stuff started to bubble up, even before Trump said anything at the debate, this had been bubbling up for a few days beforehand, and already it was known that there was no hard evidence. It was already known before Trump said anything that one of the examples of someone eating a cat seems to have been this extremely mentally disturbed American-born person from a different town. So it didn't even have anything to do with Haitian immigrants at all. So even by that time, it was known that this was just an unsupported, baseless allegation. And yet MAGA was running with it with, AI-generated kitten pictures with AR-15s and Donald Trump like protecting kittens and ducks in his arms. And you could tell they're just having a great time with it. And this is something that has happened numerous times in the era of Trump. It is take something that is infuriating to other people and just double down on it. And you double down on it in part or in large part because it's infuriating. This is sort of the trigger the libs mindset, or this is the, Daily Wire for years sold this mug or tumbler that was hot and cold liberal tears. So you're literally taking delight. Your joy is in creating the other person's anger and angst. And that is that is a pervasive element of MAGA, is sort of taking pleasure. And, you've seen the people who say, I'm for Trump because bleep you. Like it's this sort of mindset of you're mad, I'm glad. And that you miss it if you're on the outside because you're just getting all the venom. If you're on the outside, it looks like the angriest movement you can imagine because they're just venom is pouring out on you. If you're inside it, it's like a fraternity party rager in a neighbor's house where you're like tearing it to pieces, and maybe you overturn their car, and the next morning you wake up and say, man, that was an incredible party. Meanwhile, the neighbor is like, look at what has happened in my house.
Right. Okay. So the reason why that caught my attention, other than the kind of parallel to the Harris campaign and its focus on joy, it is, you've written about this. I've heard many people, both right and left, talk about it, but since 2015, 2016, there has been, to a degree, an effort to I don't know what the right word is here, but to not present Trump supporters or MAGA people as, to use Hillary Clinton's term, a basket of deplorables.
Right.
Like, there's been an apology for Trump supporters as well. These are people who they're not engaging in media that's telling them the full story, or they're really worried about the decline of the middle class or the working class in America, or they're seeing their jobs disappear, or they've been ravaged by fentanyl and drugs in their communities. And so there's all these reasons to excuse their support for Donald Trump. And some people simply, it's their conscience because of abortion or whatever. They voted for Donald Trump, as the Pope would say. But when I read your piece and you talk about this pervasive idea of reveling in the cruelty and taking joy in lib tears and all that kind of stuff, at some point, do we need to just call out MAGA Americans and say, look, you own responsibility for this now. I'm sorry, no more excuses. It's been 9 years. We know who this guy is. We know what this movement is about. And if you continue to revel in it, that's on you. Like, this is just cruelty and it's gross. It's the frat party guys know better. They might be having fun, but they know better.
They know better. Yeah. I tweeted out some time ago, and I tweeted out when I came back to Twitter, at least through the election, that there were going to be good people who vote for Trump, good people who vote for Harris, good people who vote for third party. But not everybody who's going to be voting for any of those three, groups are good people. Not everybody is. So this sort of idea that your vote defines you is wrong. The sort of the idea that I can judge your worth as a human being by your vote is wrong. However, if you are behaving in a way where you're cruel, if you are lying, if you are cruel, regardless of who you're voting for, that's wrong. And we can start to draw some conclusions about the character of your movement by your conduct. And so I do think absolutely one of the reasons why I write and I use the term MAGA instead of Republican is there's a difference between core MAGA and your default Republican. I see it every day. I see this all the time. And so when it comes to this sort of core MAGA culture, I think there is shared responsibility from the grass tips to the grassroots that people who do and should and do know better are lying or behaving in a way that has total reckless disregard for the truth. They're glorying and inflicting pain on their enemies. They enjoy it. They love it. And I think you can't just say that's all Donald Trump's fault. These are adult Americans, right, who are reveling and inflicting pain on their fellow citizens. And you can say that's fundamentally wrong. I'm not judging you for the vote for Trump. The issue is your cruelty, your lies. And there's just no justification for that.
So I obviously agree 100% that each person is responsible for their own behavior. But the cruelty that we've talked a lot about, this is not a bug in the MAGA culture. It's a feature.
Yeah.
And it's not a occasional fault of Donald Trump's character. No. It is a feature of his character.
Defining characteristic.
Totally. So even for those who maybe are not actively participating in the cruelty, in the spreading of lies, in the fact that so many in the Republican Party who maybe wouldn't even consider themselves MAGA, but those who are nonetheless continuing to support this, I'm thinking of people like Lindsey Graham or Mitch McConnell, or go on down the list of Republican officials and state officials. Those who are nonetheless supporting this are casting a vote for the continuation of that culture. And at what point are they responsible?
Yeah, I mean, I do think they're, again, MAGA is fully responsible for what it is doing. Absolutely.
I'm not talking about the people who are putting out the memes and laughing in the cruelty of people suffering.
I do think the people who, there are a lot of Republicans, and this is where, so when I say something like good people will vote for Trump, I believe that. I also think they're making a big mistake. Mm-hmm. And I think they're making a mistake that has moral resonance. So let me talk about something, Skye, that I've personally seen and experienced in particular in evangelical culture amongst a lot of good folks. And this is a problem. They have a very narrow news diet. And so they're watching Fox maybe occasionally or Newsmax maybe occasionally. So they literally have no larger idea about sort of who Donald Trump is. They don't know much about many of his scandals. So they have a very narrow news diet. And then they have a high degree of trust in the people, the very few people that they do consume news from. So what then ends up happening is an awful lot of Republicans are just sort of possessing very partial information. They don't know the details of Trump scandals. And then B, are entirely too willing to believe and to trust some rather toxic and terrible people. So, for example, a poll indicates that Republicans are most apt to believe Donald Trump over any other news source about election results. And I'm sorry, that's on you, Republicans. Like, even if you're the greatest person, even if you're in the soup kitchen every Saturday morning or whatever, you should not be believing there's something wrong here if you're believing Donald Trump over anybody else when it comes to election results. You know, and I see this all the time, Skye, where someone will write something about you're a wolf or a heretic, or I'm a wolf or a heretic. And an ordinary, average, everyday evangelical will say, oh, I didn't know that. I'll stay away from them, rather than saying, why do you say that? What's the basis for that? And so I do think this is one of the problems that's plaguing, in particular, Republican America in this age of Trump. You just have millions of people who've tuned almost everything out except for some of the more biased, toxic sources, and are accepting that information without question. And we see this all the time, just all the time.
To wrap this up, and going back to the Pope's comments about we should all be voting based on our conscience, it's hard to disagree with that. We certainly should. I guess what I'm struggling with after 9 years in this Trump era of politics, it just feels like there's so many who are infantilizing Republican voters and MAGA voters who are saying, well, they just don't know better.
Right.
And, you know, it's because they marinate in Fox News. And I'm like, okay, a couple of years ago, maybe. We're in 2024. We are in the post-January 6th era. We have seen this guy for almost a decade up close. And that excuse is just not working for me much anymore. And I feel like I can understand somebody not voting for Harris, 100%. I get it. I can understand somebody abstaining, writing in a third party, whatever. But to actively support this at this point, I'm bewildered by people who especially claim to be followers of Jesus, who think that this feature of Trump and his movement is acceptable on any level. And so that's what I'm wrestling with, is I don't want to be condemning of my fellow Americans, certainly my sisters and brothers in Christ who are voting for Donald Trump. But I have yet to hear a really good, plausible moral argument for doing so. And what I keep hearing is they just don't know better. They don't know better. I'm like, really? Don't they at this point know better? Well,
I think at this point you could say the ignorance of who Donald Trump is inexcusable.
Right.
But it's widespread.
And of what his movement is.
Yeah, it is. So the ignorance is both simultaneously inexcusable and very real. And so, you know, what it reminds me of, Skye, is just sort of pulling out on the larger civic ignorance point in general. I remember when American Idol was just the biggest show on TV, and more people knew that Randy Jackson was a judge on American Idol than knew that John Roberts was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I mean, this is just what we're dealing with. And so, you know, you have to kind of hold in your mind two thoughts at once. Millions upon millions upon millions of Americans who are going to vote for Donald Trump have a tiny fraction of the median sort of like Twitter hobbyist, political hobbyist. They have a tiny fraction of their knowledge about Donald Trump. That's true. And it's also true that that's not good. There's no excuse for that at this point. There really isn't an excuse for it. But it is also a fact at the same time. And so that's where we are. And then there's this other cohort, which are people who know everything. They're part of the MAGA extended universe. They know about the cruelty, they know about the lies, and they just push them forward anyway. And this is something you see a lot in the sort of MAGA influencer world. That world They have no ignorance here at all. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're doing it quite intentionally.
Okay, in the time we have left, I want to talk about another piece that was, it actually just came out today in the New York Times by Ruth Graham. She's written this really fascinating article that we'll link to in the show notes. It's titled, "In a First Among Christians, Young Men Are More Religious Than Young Women." And she profiles a church in Waco, Texas, Grace Church, and the gender divide that is growing among Gen Z folks. And this phenomenon that a lot of younger men seem to be going to this church or other churches in the area. At the same time, there's an exodus of younger women. And it's just an absolutely fascinating article. And she quotes a number of folks that are friends of Holy Post, Russell Moore, Beth Allison Barr, others. For as long as I can remember from my time as a pastor, as my time working at Leadership Journal and Christianity Today, it has just been an indisputed truth that women are more religious than men. Mm-hmm. Women attend church more than men. Women serve more than men. Women tend to be the spiritual leaders in their households, among their children. And it was always this perennial battle of how do you get men to come to church, which is where Promise Keepers seemed like a silver bullet, and all these other men's ministries. Mark Driscoll built his whole platform, as toxic as that ended up being, around appealing to young men, but it was still going against the current. But the trend line seems to have changed, and there's some hypothesizing going on by people quoted in this article about what's going on. And I've not talked to you about this at all, David, but I'm curious, what do you think is going on? And do you find some of the hypotheses in the article to be credible?
Yeah, so I think there's multiple layers here. So one layer is that we do have this real crisis of masculinity in this country, that there's just millions of young men who don't know. They don't have a vision. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be masculine as opposed to feminine? What's it mean to be a man as opposed to a woman? And a lot of the conservative Protestant churches have an answer for that. You know, they have a complementarian theology of male headship. Mm-hmm. So they're presenting an answer to a question that millions and millions of young men are asking. So these more traditional churches that have the more complementarian view and lead with that, I think are a magnet for a lot of young men who don't know sort of where their place is. And then once you begin to get a critical mass, then it has a sort of a self-fulfilling kind of dynamic. In other words, you know, we've seen, for example, ways in which major ministries have turned a very explicitly combative. You know, there's the Doug Wilson ministry that is with this thing, No Quarter November. They put out like their publishing arm put out a promo that had Johnny Cash giving like somebody the middle finger. And so very much doubling down on this, like these are real men, guys engaging in like very aggressive theological combat, though I don't know what that is exactly. I think it's tweeting aggressively, but and so there's this sort of very, a message very much aimed at young men who are trying to find their way. And so I think that's a big part of the dynamic. And at the same time, elements of that push some women away. Right. So obviously, you know, what we have seen over the last 5, 10, 15 years is just an avalanche of really terrible scandal. In a lot of these it's not exclusive to it for sure. I mean, you can see scandal in more progressive spaces, but we've seen some really bad scandals in some very complementarian spaces. And so it seems to be having a push-pull effect. There's pulling in a lot of guys who are sort of drawn to a very aggressive style of masculinity, which has the effect of pushing out women who are victimized by that very aggressive style of masculinity. So I think there's this push-pull going on. I don't know. I agree with Russell that I don't know how enduring this is going to be. Mm-hmm. We do feel like we're in a pretty specific time when there is this very unusual, something that I've not really seen, of this very explicit kind of toxic theobro chest beating culture that you see online that I've not seen, really as prevalent before. And I just don't know how much staying power it has, to be honest, because at some level it's just ridiculous, that it's just silly. It's embarrassing to watch in some ways, all of this sort of chest beating masculinity online. And so I don't know how much staying power it has, but my best guess is what we have is a kind of a push-pull going on here.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. What I'm curious though about are sort of how does this fit with macro trends that we are also seeing? Mm-hmm. And when I think about it historically, going back to writings by folks like Rodney Stark, a historian, or even Tom Holland more recently with his book Dominion, they talk about what really fueled the growth of the early church movement in the Roman Empire. And one of the things that's become apparent is the message of the Christian gospel was very, very appealing to the lowest segments of Roman society, which were primarily women and the enslaved. And those populations were drawn to this message that gave them great dignity and respect in a culture that demeaned them. And even when you look at American history, historically, the groups that were often marginalized or didn't have access to high status power structures in American society were drawn to the church. I mean, the church was the established institution of strength and unity in enslaved communities, in Black communities historically. A lot of women found roles in the church that they could not have outside in society, and they flourished in those places. But now you look at the trends, the macro trends. Fewer men are going to college than women. Fewer men are married. Fewer men are thriving in many parts of this country compared to women. It's outlined in this article, what's going on. And I wonder if what you're seeing is that crisis of masculinity. Some churches are realizing, we can leverage this crisis of masculinity by making our churches appealing to these young men who want that chest thumping kind of, testosterone testament kind of view of Christianity. And women are running away for the reason you said. They're not attracted to that, but they also are being drawn to the fact that they have more opportunities out in the world.
That's interesting.
Where they are affirmed and they are given power or influence. And then in some of these complementarian churches, especially, they know I'm not going to be able to serve in any visibly significant role. So why would I be a part of that to begin with?
Well, and it's not just in the hyper complementarian spaces where it's not just that you can't serve in a visibly significant role in church, just that you're subordinate in all aspects, aspects. So, that's an interesting hypothesis. And I think as with many things, there's a two-edged sword here. So we focused on the negative, which is the sort of the pulling people in through the chest beating theobroness. But there is a positive, which is, look, there's a version of this that's really good to see young men who are struggling come to church.
Amen.
Right.
Yes.
So there are elements of this that can be just genuinely wonderful. And I will tell you, I teach undergrads, and, the young men that I interact with on campus are not chest pounding theobros. It's a very niche segment of America. That's a very small segment. There's just a lot of good guys who are looking for meaning and purpose in life, a lot of folks and so I think that in that circumstance, the thing, if what we were dealing with was a increase in the number of men and without a sort of corresponding exodus of women, I'd feel better about it.
Absolutely.
And so that's where I absolutely see, and I've written a ton, Skye, about the challenges that young men face. And one of the antidotes to the crisis of loneliness is connection, and church is a wonderful place for connection. What I do worry about is the way in which some people are exploiting the spiritual crisis in young men and implanting this just extremely aggressive, weird form of, Christian nationalism, et cetera, Christian identity politics, the whole Deus Vult groups on Twitter who are like longing for the new crusades and all of that kind of stuff that's out there. That stuff is a big problem. But if we're talking about a lot of young men coming into a church where they've been feeling alienated and now they feel connected, that's just great. That's just great. I am very concerned, though, that there are women, and young women in particular, who are heading right back out the door as some of these men come in.
So taps into something. Phil's working on a video for part of our series of explainer videos right now about this zero-sum thinking. And I worry that that has infiltrated even the way we're thinking about church and ministry. That in order for a church to serve and care for women well, it's got to alienate men. And for a church then to appeal to young men and serve them really well, it's going to have to push out women. And it's a very anti-kingdom way of thinking. It's an anti-Jesus way of thinking, but it's a very worldly way of thinking.
Right.
And is that coming into the mix here, that to do the masculine thing, you can't appeal to women?
Yeah, I do think there's some of this is this way in which we've infiltrated secular marketing into church evangelism, where you're talking about sort of reaching targeting and reaching communities with targeted messaging. Right. And I mean, some of that's just normal, sort of smart, rational thinking. Wait, if guys are losing out on any concept of meaning, to come and intentionally say to guys, look, you don't know what your place is in the world. We can help with that. Like that's all fine. But this kind of the way in which that targeting can become mutually exclusive. This is the man's church, the way that the targeting can be alienating to other constituencies or other people, other members of the community. When you're getting into that sort of targeting mindset, you have to take great care that you're not just branding, that this isn't just a branding exercise. And there's a lot of temptation for it to move in that direction, because that's kind of what our culture is: micro-targeting, branding, etc.
I agree entirely. My book, What If Jesus Was Serious About the Church? Ding ding for Taco the Bell fans. The core of that book is basically trying to say we need to stop thinking about the church as modern North Americans, which is as a corporate entity, and think of it as first century Christians, which saw it mostly as a household, as a family. And we don't have our families constructed to just be a masculine family or a feminine family. We understand that there are men and women, boys and girls in here, and they need spiritual mothers and spiritual fathers, and they need to be nurtured in the faith. And a church, I think that's just a healthier model for the church as well, to say we are a family, a household that is supporting one another, and we have different characteristics and traits, but together we are the family of Christ. And it's not a corporation with a logo and a brand and an identity that we're marketing to a target group of consumers. Right. That's what leads you down to this zero-sum kind of monolithic way of operating. David, thank you for your time again, and for your excellent writing. We'll link to these pieces that we talked about today, and hopefully next month, maybe things have slowed down enough where you've actually watched The Rings of Power, and we can nerd out right before the election.
And I would love that so much, and I'm just wallowing in shame right now. But I will say, I still defend my decision to only see it on the biggest screen imaginable.
Well, I think it's a little preview of how our conversation might go, because Rings of Power is fine. I don't think it's high art, so I'm okay watching it on a small screen. I'm not that enamored with it.
Oh my gosh. I am. So, I love season 1, every minute of it. So
yeah, I was lukewarm on it at best. So, all right. I look forward to having that discussion and to our next time together. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Skye.
French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Skye Jatani. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.